The original Resident Evil games are masterpieces, not just good for their time, not just important historically, genuinely great games that understood what survival horror meant and delivered that experience without compromise. We're talking about the first three titles on the PlayStation 1, the ones that defined a genre in the 1990s before the industry figured out how to monetize nostalgia. Those games were made by developers who were experimenting, taking risks, building something new. They weren't trying to recapture magic from an earlier era because they were creating that magic in real time. But fast forward to today, and we have a parade of remakes that promise to bring these classics to modern audiences. And while those remakes are technically impressive, something fundamental got lost. Something more important than graphics or smoother controls. The remakes feel like products designed to extract money from an established fan base rather than experiences crafted with the same passion and risk-taking that made the originals special. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Game companies have figured out that remaking beloved titles is safer and more profitable than creating new ones. You already have brand recognition. You already have a built-in audience. You already know the game works because it worked 30 years ago. All you have to do is update the graphics, streamline the rough edges, and market it to people who remember the original plus younger players who missed it the first time. It's a business strategy masquerading as artistic preservation, and fans deserve better than being treated like a reliable revenue stream. If you enjoy this type of deep dive into gaming, hit that like button to help other fans find this video, and let me know down in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love hearing from the late night crew checking in from different time zones. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's get started. The foundation of fear, Resident Evil launched in 1996 and immediately established a new vocabulary for horror gaming. You played as members of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service investigating a mansion on the outskirts of Raccoon City. The pharmaceutical corporation Umbrella had been conducting biological weapons research, and the results had gotten loose. Zombies shambled through opulent hallways. Mutated creatures lurked in laboratories. And you, as either Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, had limited ammunition and even more limited understanding of what had gone wrong. The formula that Capcom created became the blueprint. Fixed camera angles showing pre-rendered backgrounds, tank controls that made movement deliberate, limited inventory space forcing constant resource management, item boxes for storage scattered throughout safe rooms, save points that consumed ink ribbons, and enemies that followed predictable patterns once you learned them. The horror came from scarcity, not enough bullets, not enough health, not enough information, but you could get better. You could learn enemy placements, optimize routes, memorize puzzle solutions. Speedrunners eventually completed the game in under 2 hours. By the time Resident Evil 2 launched in 1998, the series had refined its approach. The game expanded beyond the mansion into Raccoon City itself, or at least portions of it. You navigated streets overrun with the undead before finding questionable sanctuary in the Raccoon Police Department. The scale felt larger, the stakes higher. A whole city had fallen. And then Resident Evil 3 arrived in 1999, putting you in the role of Jill Valentine as she attempted to escape while being hunted by Nemesis, an intelligent bioweapon that pursued you relentlessly. These three games on the PlayStation 1 created a specific kind of dread. The fixed camera angles meant you often couldn't see what was around corners. The tank controls made fleeing feel clumsy and desperate. The pre-rendered backgrounds were beautiful but static, giving environments a frozen quality that made any movement within them feel like a violation. And the resource management turned every encounter into a math problem. Is this zombie worth a bullet? Or can I dodge past it and conserve ammunition for something worse ahead? The remakes, starting with the Resident Evil 1 remake in 2002 for the GameCube and continuing through the recent remakes of 2, 3, and 4, updated these mechanics for modern sensibilities. Over-the-shoulder cameras replaced fixed angles. Movement became more fluid. Graphics jumped from pre-rendered backgrounds to fully three-dimensional environments. But in gaining fluidity and cinematic presentation, something essential shifted. The remakes often feel like you're being guided through a horror movie rather than surviving one yourself. What the remakes changed. Let's start with what the remakes did right because it's important to acknowledge their strengths. The Resident Evil 1 remake is arguably perfect. It adhered closely to the original structure while enhancing nearly everything. The mansion was expanded with new areas. Puzzles were redesigned. The Crimson Heads added a new layer of threat, forcing you to burn zombie corpses or risk them returning faster and deadlier. Lisa Trevor, a tragic character whose story added emotional depth, became a haunting presence. The remake didn't just update the original, it deepened it. But the remakes of 2 and 3 took a different approach. They reimagined rather than refined, and in reimagining, they made choices that fundamentally altered what made the originals work. Consider Resident Evil 2. The original game opened with an extended sequence through Raccoon City streets. You played as either Leon Kennedy or Claire Redfield, and before you ever reached the Raccoon Police Department, you had to navigate blocks of urban decay. Zombies filled the streets. Buildings were inaccessible or on fire. The challenge was brutal, especially for first-time players. You could die within the first 10 to 12 seconds if you didn't immediately understand the controls and how to maneuver around threats. This difficulty served a narrative purpose. The streets were meant to be overwhelming, meant to communicate that staying outside was suicide. The chaos couldn't be brute force with ammunition or skill. It was about survival through evasion, about recognizing that the city itself had become unlivable. When you finally reached the Raccoon Police Department, the game created a false sense of sanctuary. You'd fought so hard to get inside, surely you were safe now. But then you saw Marvin Gillespie bleeding out on the floor. You caught a glimpse of a licker scuttling past a window, and you realized the police station was just another kind of trap. The remake removes almost all of this. The opening sequence through Raccoon City is brief, less than 40 seconds if you simply hold the run button. Zombies are present but barely aggressive. You breeze through the streets and enter the police station with minimal resistance. The entire narrative beat of fighting your way to safety, only to discover safety doesn't exist, gets lost. The remake seems afraid to make the player struggle before the main game begins. It wants you comfortable, wants you in the police station quickly, so the real game can start. But in doing so, it eliminates the context that makes the police station's horror meaningful. The original also included Kendo's gun shop during that street sequence. You could enter, grab a shotgun early if you were quick or willing to fight for it, and this choice rippled through the rest of the game. Having the shotgun early meant you could tackle the east wing of the police station immediately, an area normally too zombie dense to handle with just the handgun. It gave players agency, let them sequence break slightly, rewarded exploration and risk-taking. The remake moves the gun shop to a later section of Leon's campaign and makes it a scripted story moment rather than a player-driven choice. This pattern repeats throughout the remake. The game is more linear, more guided. There are fewer branching paths, fewer decisions about which areas to tackle first. The A and B scenarios, which in the original felt meaningfully different with unique story beats and enemy encounters, are nearly identical in the remake. Playing Leon A and Claire B in the original felt like experiencing two halves of a larger story. In the remake, the scenarios feel like slightly remixed versions of the same playthrough. Resident Evil 3's remake faced even harsher criticism. The original game doubled down on player choice through its live selection system. Moments where the game paused and offered you binary decisions that affected which path you took. These weren't just cosmetic, they changed which areas you visited, which encounters you faced, even which ending you received. The game was designed around replayability, around experimenting with different choices to see how the story shifted. The remake removes the live selection system entirely. It also cuts massive portions of the original's content. The clock tower, an iconic location where you solved puzzles and fought Nemesis in multiple forms, is reduced to a brief outdoor set piece. Raccoon Park, which served as a transitional area and housed the Gravedigger boss fight, is now a tiny connector with no enemies and no puzzles. The Dead Factory, the original's final location, doesn't exist. Entire enemy types were removed: brainsuckers, crows, drain demo spiders, the Gravedigger. Nemesis himself, while visually impressive, loses his unpredictability. In the original, he could appear in multiple locations depending on your choices, creating genuine tension about when and where you'd encounter him next. In the remake, his appearances are scripted and predictable. The remake of 3 also suffers from the same issue as 2. Raccoon City itself feels smaller. The original devoted significant time to exploration of the city's streets, giving you a sense of geography and scale. The remake funnels you through linear corridors disguised as streets, then moves you into interior locations as quickly as possible. For a game whose entire premise is escaping a city under quarantine, you spend remarkably little time actually in that city. The philosophy of player agency. What these changes reveal is a fundamental shift in design philosophy. The original Resident Evil games were survival simulations. They were about resource management, route planning, risk assessment. You were given a space and a goal, and how you achieved that goal was largely up to you. Do you fight every enemy or conserve ammunition by dodging? Do you explore every room or rush to your objective? Do you use your healing items now or save them for later? These decisions mattered because resources were genuinely scarce and your mistakes had consequences. Modern game design often prioritizes smooth progression over player choice. The remakes guide you more explicitly, reduce the number of wrong turns you can take, ensure that even if you waste resources, the game compensates so you're never truly stuck. This makes the games more accessible, less frustrating, easier to complete on a first attempt, but it also reduces the sense of accomplishment that came from mastering the original systems. The street sequence in the original Resident Evil 2 serves as a perfect microcosm of this difference. That sequence was hard, sometimes brutally so. Players complained about it. Some people never made it past the opening. But that difficulty served multiple purposes. It taught you the controls under pressure. It communicated the stakes immediately. And it created a contrast that made the police station's relative calm feel earned. You'd fought through hell to get inside, so even though the police station was dangerous, it felt like an improvement. The remake's abbreviated street sequence removes that difficulty, and with it, the emotional arc. You barely struggle to reach the police station, so its dangers don't feel like escalation. The game becomes flatter emotionally, more consistent in tone, but less dynamic in how it makes you feel. This extends to combat design as well. In the original games, combat was clunky by modern standards, but deliberately so. The tank controls meant turning to face an enemy took time. The fixed camera angles meant you often couldn't see threats until they were close. Aiming was stiff, movement was slow, and enemies could quickly overwhelm you if you weren't careful. This clumsiness served the horror. You weren't a trained soldier effortlessly dispatching threats. You were someone barely holding it together, and the controls reflected that. The remakes give you more fluid movement, better aiming, smoother combat. You feel competent, capable. Leon in the Resident Evil 2 remake moves with confidence, aims precisely, handles weapons like someone who knows what they're doing. This is satisfying from a gameplay perspective, but it undercuts the vulnerability that made the originals scary. When you know you can reliably kill enemies, they become obstacles rather than threats. When combat is smooth and responsive, encounters become action sequences rather than desperate struggles. The original Resident Evil 3 understood this. Jill Valentine, despite being a trained STARS member, still moved with the same tank controls, still aimed with the same stiffness. The game made Nemesis terrifying not just because he was powerful, but because you were limited. Your ability to fight back felt inadequate, which made running the smarter choice. The remake gives Jill a dodge mechanic, smoother aiming, and more responsive controls. She feels powerful, and while this is fun to play, it changes the dynamic. Nemesis becomes a challenging boss fight rather than an existential threat you're barely escaping. The illusion of space. One of the most striking differences between the originals and the remakes is how they handle environmental storytelling and spatial design. The original games, constrained by PlayStation 1 hardware, used pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles. This created a specific aesthetic. Environments were beautiful, detailed, and static. Rooms felt like dioramas, perfectly composed scenes that you moved through. This approach had limitations, certainly. You couldn't rotate the camera to look around. Perspective was locked to what the developers wanted you to see, but these limitations created opportunities. The fixed cameras could frame environments for maximum atmosphere. A hallway could be shot from an angle that made it feel longer and more claustrophobic. A room could be presented from above, making you feel small and exposed. The cameras became characters themselves, shaping how you experience space. The remakes use fully three-dimensional environments with controllable cameras. This is objectively more advanced technology. You can look around freely, examine details from any angle, move the camera to see threats before they reach you. But in gaining control, you lose the careful framing that the originals provided. Environments in the remakes feel functional rather than composed. They're spaces you move through rather than scenes you inhabit. This shift affects horror in subtle ways. The original Resident Evil 2 presented the police station as a series of carefully framed vignettes. Each room had a specific camera angle designed to maximize tension or create specific reveals. The remake's free camera means you can scan rooms immediately upon entering, eliminating surprises. You gain information more quickly, which makes you feel safer, which reduces fear. The pre-rendered backgrounds also created a sense of depth and detail that three-dimensional environments on the PlayStation 1 couldn't match. The Raccoon Police Department in the original game felt opulent, decayed, full of history. Every room had paintings, furniture, architectural details rendered in high-resolution artwork. The remake's police station is impressive, certainly, but it has to render everything in real time, which means less detail per surface, simpler geometry, fewer objects cluttering spaces. Space itself functioned differently in the original games. The The fixed cameras and pre-rendered backgrounds meant that areas could be larger than they appeared. A room might seem sprawling because of how the camera presented it, even if the actual playable space was modest. The remake's real-time environments are literally what they appear to be, which paradoxically can make them feel smaller despite being technically larger. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Raccoon City itself. The original Resident Evil 2 and 3 presented the city through carefully selected vignettes, key streets, important buildings, transitional areas. You never saw the whole city, but the pre-rendered background suggested a larger world beyond what was playable. Distant buildings, blocked streets, background details all created the impression of a fully realized urban environment undergoing collapse. The remakes attempt to recreate this but struggle. Three-dimensional environments require full modeling of everything visible, which is resource intensive. So the remakes pare down what you see, simplify geometry, reduce the density of background details. The result is city streets that feel more like corridors, with obvious boundaries and less convincing suggestion of a larger world beyond the playable space. Critics of the originals would argue that this is simply nostalgia, that pre-rendered backgrounds were a technological limitation rather than an artistic choice, and that modern, fully three-dimensional environments are objectively superior. And from a purely technical standpoint, they're right, but technology serves design, and the question isn't which approach is more advanced, but which approach better serves the horror the games are trying to create. The sound of silence sound design is another area where the originals and remakes diverge significantly. The original Resident Evil games used minimal ambient sound, letting silence do much of the work. You'd walk through empty hallways hearing only your own footsteps. Zombies groaned from nearby rooms, creating ambiguity about their location and proximity. Music was used sparingly, reserved for specific moments of heightened tension or danger. This approach made individual sounds more impactful. A door creaking open was an event because it broke the silence. Gunshots were shockingly loud. Item pickups had satisfying audio cues that stood out against the quiet. The games trained you to listen carefully, to use audio as much as visuals to navigate threats. The remakes use more constant ambient sound, likely to fill space and maintain atmosphere in a way that modern audiences expect. There are environmental loops, distant industrial noises, constant audio presence. This is more technically sophisticated and arguably more realistic. Abandoned buildings make sounds they're not perfectly silent, but the constant audio baseline means individual sounds have less impact. Everything exists at a similar audio priority level, which flattens the soundscape. The original games also use music more strategically. Safe rooms had that iconic calming theme, a reliable audio cue that you were temporarily secure. When music kicked in during gameplay, it signaled danger, often preceding enemy encounters. The games trained you to associate music with threat, which made the silence during exploration feel safe by comparison, even though it wasn't. The remakes use music more liberally, often playing atmospheric scores during exploration. This maintains cinematic energy, but reduces the contrast between safe and dangerous moments. When music is always present, it stops being a warning system and becomes wallpaper. Narrative structure and pacing. The original Resident Evil games had straightforward narratives delivered through a mix of cutscenes, documents, and environmental storytelling. The stories weren't complex. Evil corporation creates virus, virus escapes, heroes must survive and expose the truth. What made them effective was how the gameplay and narrative reinforced each other. You weren't just learning that the mansion was dangerous, You were experiencing that danger through resource scarcity and enemy encounters. The pacing was player controlled. You could rush through critical path objectives or spend time exploring, reading documents, piecing together backstory. The games rarely forced narrative moments on you outside of key plot points. Most of your time was spent in gameplay, making decisions, managing resources, solving puzzles. The remakes tend toward more cinematic presentation. There are more cutscenes, more scripted sequences, more moments where control is taken from you to show you something. This isn't inherently bad. The cutscenes are well produced and add dramatic weight, but they also interrupt the flow of gameplay more frequently. Resident Evil 3 Remake particularly leans into this cinematic approach. Significant portions of the game are spent in set-piece sequences, escaping a collapsing building, defending against waves of enemies, running from nemesis through scripted chases. These are exciting to play through once, but they're also on-rails experiences that play out the same way every time. The original game had fewer of these moments, giving you more time to explore at your own pace. This shift reflects broader changes in game design over the past 2 decades. Modern audiences often expect games to be more like interactive movies, with high production values, frequent story beats, and directed pacing. The original Resident Evil games came from an era where games were expected to be systems you mastered, with story serving gameplay rather than the reverse. Neither approach is objectively better, but they serve different purposes. The original's focus on player-driven exploration and resource management created a specific kind of engagement. You were constantly making decisions, constantly assessing situations, constantly aware of your vulnerability. The remake's cinematic approach creates spectacle and emotional peaks, but reduces the moment-to-moment decision-making that made the originals feel like survival simulations. The question of replay value. One of the original trilogy's greatest strengths was replay value. These were games designed to be played multiple times with different characters, different difficulty levels, different choices. Resident Evil 2 had 4 scenarios: Leon A, Claire B, Claire A, Leon B. These weren't just cosmetic variations. The scenarios had different item placements, different enemy encounters, different story beats. Playing all 4 scenarios was necessary to see the complete story. Resident Evil 3's live selection system created branching paths that changed which areas you visited and in what order. Different choices led to different encounters with Nemesis, different story outcomes, different epilogues. The game actively encouraged experimentation across multiple playthroughs. The remakes reduced this replay incentive. Resident Evil 2 Remake's A and B scenarios are barely differentiated. The same spaces are traversed in roughly the same order, with minor variations. There's little reason to play both beyond completionism. Resident Evil 3 Remake eliminates the branching paths entirely, making every playthrough nearly identical. This matters because replayability extended the game's value and deepened engagement. Each playthrough taught you more about the systems, revealed new details, let you experiment with different strategies. The games rewarded mastery, gave you reasons to return beyond just experiencing the story again. The remakes feel more like one-and-done experiences. You can replay them certainly, and higher difficulties add challenge, but the core experience doesn't change much. Once you've seen the story and navigated the spaces, subsequent playthroughs feel like repetition rather than exploration. Critics might argue that most players don't replay games anyway, that designing for multiple playthroughs is inefficient when most people will only complete a game once. And statistically, they may be right, But the players who do engage deeply with games, who spend hours mastering systems and discovering secrets, are often the most passionate advocates. The original Resident Evil games built dedicated communities precisely because they rewarded this kind of deep engagement. Gets lost? So what exactly gets lost in the transition from original to remake? It's not just nostalgia, though nostalgia certainly colors how longtime fans perceive these games. It's a collection of specific design choices that created a particular experience, and that experience is difficult to replicate with modern design sensibilities. The originals were comfortable making you uncomfortable. They let you struggle, let you make mistakes, let you fail. The remakes are more forgiving, more accommodating, more concerned with ensuring every player can complete them. This accessibility is valuable, but it comes at the cost of the edge that made the originals frightening. The originals trusted you to figure things out. Puzzles could be obtuse, routes could be unclear, documents provided clues, but you had to read them, remember them, connect information across different areas. The remakes hold your hand more, waypoints on maps, more explicit hints, puzzles that are simpler or more intuitive. Again, this aids accessibility, but it reduces the sense of accomplishment that came from solving challenging problems independently. The originals were willing to waste your time. Backtracking was constant. You'd walk the same hallways dozens of times, dodging the same zombies because inventory space was limited and resources were scattered. This sounds tedious, and sometimes it was, but it also built familiarity with the environment. You learned every corner of the Spencer Mansion or the Raccoon Police Department because you had to. The spaces became real in a way that more streamlined games locations don't. The remakes respect your time more, less backtracking, more efficient layouts, quicker progression. This is arguably better game design by contemporary standards, but it also means you spend less time inhabiting these spaces, which makes them feel less like places and more like levels. The originals had a specific kind of jank that contributed to their identity. The tank controls were clunky. The voice acting was often hilariously bad. The plots had holes. But these imperfections gave the games personality. They felt handmade, rough around the edges in ways that made them endearing. The remakes are polished to a shine. Everything is refined, professional, quality controlled. This makes them objectively better crafted products, but it also makes them feel more corporate, less weird, less willing to take risks. The exception, Resident Evil 1 Remake. It's worth noting that the Resident Evil 1 Remake, released in 2002 for the GameCube, is widely considered to be not only equal to the original but potentially superior. This remake worked because it understood what made the original effective and enhanced those elements rather than replacing them. The remake kept the fixed camera angles and tank controls, understanding that these weren't just limitations but fundamental to the game's identity. It kept the same basic structure and pacing. What it added expanded rather than replaced. New areas of the mansion, additional puzzles, the Crimson Head mechanic that made zombie management more strategic, and the Lisa Trevor subplot that added emotional depth. The remake's approach was additive. Everything from the original was still present. The remake just gave you more of it. This is fundamentally different from the approach taken with the 2 and 3 remakes, which replaced and streamlined rather than expanded. The success of the Resident Evil 1 remake proves that modernizing classic games doesn't require abandoning their core design. You can update graphics, refine mechanics, add content, and still preserve what made the original work. The question is whether developers understand what elements were essential versus which were limitations to be overcome. The 2 and 3 remakes seem to conclude that fixed cameras and tank controls were outdated, that pre-rendered backgrounds were technical constraints, that resource scarcity was punishing, that backtracking was tedious. They fixed these elements with modern equivalents, free cameras, fluid movement, real-time environments, more generous resources, streamlined layouts, and in doing so they created games that function well by contemporary standards but feel fundamentally different from their predecessors. The remake industrial complex. Let's acknowledge what's happening across the gaming industry. Remakes and remasters have become a dominant business strategy. According to industry analysis from Ampere Research, consumers now spend twice as much money on remakes compared to remasters, with approximately $1.4 billion spent on remakes and remasters combined in recent years. Capcom's financial reports tell the story clearly. The Resident Evil 2 remake sold over 5 million copies by the end of 2019 and has since become the best-selling Resident Evil game ever, with over 12 million copies sold. Resident Evil 4 Remake sold 3 million units in its first 2 days, reaching 4 million within 2 weeks. These are staggering numbers that any new intellectual property would struggle to match. And the development costs were lower than creating something original because the structure already existed. The level design, the story beats, the pacing, the puzzle solutions, all of that was already figured out. The remakes are essentially repackaging existing creative work with modern production values. This wouldn't be problematic if the remakes honored what made the originals special, but they don't. They sand down the rough edges, remove the challenge, streamline the experience for maximum accessibility and minimum friction. They're designed to appeal to the broadest possible audience because that's what generates maximum revenue. The result is games that feel focus tested, committee approved, and designed by spreadsheet rather than passion. The original Resident Evil games were made by teams who didn't know if survival horror would even work as a genre. They were taking risks, experimenting with fixed cameras and tank controls and resource scarcity because they had a vision for what horror gaming could be. The remakes are made by teams executing a business plan, hitting sales targets, and ensuring the product doesn't alienate potential customers. You can feel the difference in every design choice. Stripping away challenge. The most telling sign that remakes prioritize profit over quality is how they handle difficulty. The original games were brutal. They respected you enough as a player to let you fail, to let you make mistakes that had lasting consequences, to trust that you'd figure things out without constant hand-holding. Consider the opening of the original Resident Evil 2. You had to navigate streets packed with zombies, figure out the controls under pressure, and reach the police station through trial and error. Many players died repeatedly in those first few minutes. It was punishing, sometimes unfairly so, but that difficulty served a purpose. It communicated stakes. It taught you that resources mattered, that every decision had weight, that survival wasn't guaranteed. The remake removes almost all of that challenge. The street sequence is shortened to less than 40 seconds. Zombies barely aggro. You breeze into the police station with minimal resistance. Why? Because focus testing revealed that players found the original opening frustrating, and frustration might lead to refunds or negative reviews. So the challenge that gave the original its teeth gets removed in favor of a smooth, accessible experience that won't scare off casual players. This pattern repeats throughout the remakes. Puzzles are simpler or provide more obvious hints. Resources are more plentiful. Save points no longer require consumable ink ribbons. The games guide you more explicitly, reduce opportunities to get stuck, ensure that even if you waste resources, you'll still have enough to progress. These are quality of life improvements if you're being generous, or they're the systematic removal of everything that made survival horror meaningful if you're being honest. The original game said, figure it out or fail. The remakes say, we need you to reach the end so you'll buy the DLC and recommend the game to your friends. One approach treats you like a player capable of overcoming challenge. The other treats you like a consumer whose experience must be optimized for maximum retention and monetization. The illusion of value game companies have become experts at making you feel like you're getting more than you actually are. The remakes are marketed with impressive trailers showing photorealistic graphics, motion captured performances, and cinematic production values, and on a surface level they deliver. The Resident Evil remakes look spectacular. They sound incredible. The voice acting is professional. The cutscenes are well directed. Spectacle isn't the same as substance. The original games had a fraction of the budget, primitive graphics by modern standards, voice acting that was often laughably bad, yet they delivered more meaningful gameplay, more replayability, more respect for your intelligence as a player. They were designed around systems and spaces that created emergent moments of horror. The remakes are designed around set pieces and scripted sequences that look great but play the same way every time. The original Resident Evil 3 had the live selection system, moments where the game paused and offered you choices that changed which areas you visited, which encounters you faced, which ending you received. It had branching paths, multiple ways to approach situations, genuine replayability. The remake removes all of that in favor of a linear experience that funnels you through predetermined sequences. Why? Because branching paths require more development time and testing. Linear games are cheaper to make. The illusion of choice costs money, so it gets cut. The remake also removes massive portions of content from the original. The clock tower location becomes a brief outdoor set piece instead of a full area with puzzles and exploration. Raccoon Park is reduced to a tiny connector. The dead factory, the original's final location, doesn't exist. Entire enemy types are gone. Brain suckers, crows, drain Deimos, the gravedigger boss. The remake is objectively smaller than the game it's remaking, yet it launched at full price, $60 for less content than a game that cost $50 20 years earlier. This is the con. Make it look more expensive so you can charge more money while delivering less actual game. Prioritize production values that look good in trailers over gameplay depth that reveals itself over hours of play. Bank on the fact that most players will complete the game once, never realizing how much was cut, and leave a positive review based on the impressive graphics and smooth gameplay. Disrespecting legacy. What makes this trend particularly galling is how it treats the original games and the fans who love them. The remakes aren't presented as alternatives or new interpretations. They're marketed as definitive versions, the way these games were meant to be experienced. The implication is that the originals were flawed, limited, outdated, that they needed fixing. This is revisionist nonsense. The original Resident Evil games weren't limited by technology in ways that hurt them. The fixed camera angles weren't a compromise. They were an artistic choice that created specific framing and atmosphere. The tank controls weren't a failure of design. They were a deliberate decision to make movement clunky and desperate. The pre-rendered backgrounds weren't a workaround. They allowed for detail and depth that real-time rendering on PlayStation 1 couldn't match. The developers of the originals made intentional choices within their constraints, and those choices created a specific experience. The remakes look at those choices and say, we know better now. then replace them with modern conventions that are more familiar but less distinctive. Fixed cameras become free cameras because that's what modern games do. Tank controls become fluid movement because that's what players expect. Pre-rendered backgrounds become real-time environments because that's what the technology allows. But in gaining what's expected and familiar, the remakes lose what was special and unique. They sand away the distinctive edges that made Resident Evil stand apart, replacing them with the same over-the-shoulder camera, the same fluid combat, the same streamlined design that dozens of other games use. The remakes feel like Resident Evil flavored versions of generic, modern action horror rather than survival horror games that happen to have modern graphics. And the fans who love the originals, they're told they're being nostalgic, that they're remembering these games as better than they were, that the remakes are objectively superior. It's gaslighting dressed as game criticism. The originals were remarkable achievements that millions of people loved for specific reasons. The remakes are competent products that sacrifice what made those games special in pursuit of broader appeal and higher sales. The economics of exploitation. Here's what the industry has learned. Established intellectual property is more valuable than new ideas. Resident Evil 2 Remake didn't need to prove that survival horror could work. The original already did that 30 years ago. It didn't need to build an audience. That audience already existed, waiting to buy a new entry in a beloved franchise. It didn't need to take creative risks. The original already took those risks and succeeded. From a business perspective, this makes perfect sense. Developing new IP is expensive and risky. Most new franchises fail, but remakes have built-in name recognition, existing fan bases, and proven concepts. They're as close to guaranteed profit as the gaming industry gets. That's why we're drowning in remakes, remasters, and reboots across all media, not just games. But this creates a vicious cycle. When remakes consistently outsell original games, publishers learn that nostalgia is more profitable than innovation, so they greenlight more remakes and fewer new projects. The industry becomes increasingly risk-averse, more focused on exploiting existing properties than creating new ones. And fans suffer because we get endless iterations of things we've already experienced, instead of new ideas that could become the classics of tomorrow. Capcom's strategy with Resident Evil exemplifies this. They've released remakes of 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're working through the entire back catalog, updating each game for modern platforms, charging full price for each release. It's a conveyor belt of repackaged content that generates massive revenue with relatively modest investment. And it works because fans keep buying them, hoping each one will finally capture what made the original special, not realizing that the thing that made the original special, creative risk-taking and uncompromising design, is exactly what modern corporate game development won't allow. What gets sacrificed when profit becomes the primary motive? Specific elements get sacrificed first. Anything that might frustrate players gets smoothed out. Anything that might confuse casual audiences gets simplified. Anything that appeals only to hardcore fans gets cut. The result is games designed by committee, polished to the point of blandness, optimized for maximum market penetration rather than maximum artistic integrity. The original Resident Evil trilogy was willing to be weird. The mansion in the first game had puzzles involving musical notes, paintings, and absurd key systems that made no logical sense but created memorable gameplay. The police station in the second game was elaborately overdesigned with hidden passages and security system that no real building would have. The city in the third game had pacing that was sometimes awkward, branching paths that were sometimes confusing, but also genuine player agency that made each playthrough feel unique. The remakes file off these weird edges. Puzzles become more logical and intuitive, which also makes them more forgettable. Environments become more realistic, which also makes them less distinctive. Progression becomes more streamlined, which also makes it less interesting. Everything that was strange and memorable about the originals gets replaced with the same design conventions every other modern game uses. This isn't preservation, it's homogenization. The remakes aren't bringing these games to new audiences. They're erasing what made them special and replacing them with generic, modern equivalents that happen to have the same names and basic plots. Future generations won't experience Resident Evil. They'll experience Resident Evil as filtered through contemporary game design, trends, stripped of context and distinctiveness. The silent majority. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. Most people who play the remakes will never know what was lost. If you never experienced the original Resident Evil 2, the remake seems fantastic. The graphics are impressive, the gameplay is solid, the production values are high. You have no frame of reference for what's missing because you never experienced it. This is by design. The remakes are made primarily for new audiences, not longtime fans. Longtime fans are a guaranteed sale regardless. They'll buy the remake out of curiosity or hope, even if they're skeptical. But new audiences are the real target, the people who will judge the remake on its own merits without comparing it to the original. And for those new audiences, the remakes work perfectly well. They're good games that deliver hours of entertainment. The problem is that they could have been so much more. They could have respected the original's design philosophy while updating the presentation. They could have expanded rather than replaced. They could have been made by people who understood what made these games special instead of people executing a business plan. But that would have required caring about more than profit. It would have required treating these games as art worth preserving rather than IP worth exploiting. And in the modern gaming industry, where publicly traded corporations must prioritize shareholder value above all else, that's increasingly rare. Because you're still here, let me tell you what this really costs us. It's not just that the remakes are inferior to the originals, though they are. It's that the success of these remakes teaches the industry all the wrong lessons. It tells them that we'll accept less as long as it looks pretty, that we value spectacle over substance, that nostalgia is more profitable than innovation, and every time we buy these remakes, we're funding a future with fewer risks, less creativity, and more corporate calculation. The pattern across gaming Resident Evil isn't alone in this. The entire gaming industry has embraced remakes and remasters as a business strategy. The Last of Us got a remaster 13 months after its original release on PlayStation 3, then a full remake 9 years later. Skyrim has been re-released on every platform imaginable. Grand Theft Auto 5 launched on 3 separate console generations. Companies are mining their back catalogs because it's easier than creating new content. And when these remakes are done poorly, when they're obvious cash grabs with minimal effort, the industry shrugs and moves on. Grand Theft Auto, the trilogy, definitive edition launched in a broken state, with visual downgrades and technical problems that made the originals objectively superior. Yet it still sold millions of copies because people wanted to revisit those games, and it was the only option available. This creates a hostage situation. Want to play Resident Evil 2? The original is available, technically, but it's not on modern platforms without workarounds. It's not marketed. It's not supported. The remake is positioned as the only real option, the version you're supposed to play. So you buy it even if you have reservations because you want to experience that story and world. And the company has made sure their repackaged version is the most accessible option. This is exploitation dressed as preservation. We're bringing these classics to new audiences, they say, while really they're ensuring that new audiences only experience sanitized, modernized, corporate approved versions that have been stripped of anything that might not test well with focus groups. What fans deserve respect. That's the core of it. Respect for our intelligence, respect for our time, respect for the fact that we're not just wallets to be opened with the right combination of nostalgia and marketing. We deserve remakes that understand what made the originals work and enhance those elements rather than replacing them. We deserve developers who study the original games deeply enough to recognize which elements were essential and which were limitations. We deserve creative teams who are making these remakes because they love the source material, not because executives identified a profitable opportunity. The Resident Evil 1 remake, released in 2002, proves this is possible. That remake kept the fixed cameras and tank controls because the developers understood these weren't flaws to fix. It kept the same structure and pacing. What it added expanded the experience rather than replacing it. New areas, the Crimson Head mechanic, the Lisa Trevor subplot. It was made by people who respected the original enough to preserve its core while building around it. Compare that to the recent remakes, which seem embarrassed by the original's design choices, eager to modernize and streamline everything into the same template every other game follows. The difference is respect. The R remake was made with love for the source material. The recent remakes are made with profit projections and market analysis. We also deserve honesty. If you're going to cut half the content from Resident Evil 3, don't charge $60 for it. If you're going to streamline and simplify Resident Evil 2, don't claim it's the definitive version. Be honest that these are reimaginings made for different audiences with different priorities. Let the originals stand on their own merit instead of positioning the remakes as replacements. Most importantly, we deserve new ideas. Every dollar and development hour spent on remakes is a dollar an hour not spent creating the next great survival horror game, the next innovative experience, the next classic that future generations will look back on with the same fondness we have for the original Resident Evil trilogy. The false choice. The industry wants you to believe you have to choose, either embrace remakes and stop being nostalgic for the past, or reject progress and insist everything was better before. This is a false dichotomy designed to shut down criticism. You can want games to evolve and improve while also recognizing that specific older games got things right in ways modern games don't. You can appreciate new technology while questioning whether that technology is being used to create better experiences or just prettier ones. You can enjoy remakes while still acknowledging they're inferior to the originals in important ways. The original Resident Evil games are objectively better at specific things: resource management, player agency, replayability, challenge, creating vulnerability-based horror. The remakes are objectively better at other things: graphics, production values, accessibility, cinematic presentation. The question is, which of these things matter more for survival horror, and the answer determines which version you'll prefer. But here's the thing, we shouldn't have to choose. With the resources these companies have, they could make remakes that preserve the original strengths while adding modern production values. They could expand rather than replace. They could respect the source material while updating it for new audiences. They don't, because that would cost more money and take more time. It's cheaper and faster to plug the basic story and setting into their standard modern game template, smooth out anything that might be challenging or confusing, and ship it with impressive graphics. The calculation is purely economic. Will this approach generate sufficient profit? And since the answer is consistently yes, there's no incentive to do better. The cost of complacency. Every time you buy a lazy remake, you're telling the industry that this approach works. You're funding future games that will follow the same pattern. Take beloved classic, strip out what made it special, replace with generic modern design, market heavily on nostalgia, charge full price. This isn't just about Resident Evil. It's about the entire trajectory of gaming as a medium. Are we going to be an industry that constantly looks backward, endlessly remaking and rebooting and remastering existing properties? Or are we going to demand that companies take risks, fund new ideas, create the classics of tomorrow instead of endlessly recycling the classics of yesterday? The success of remakes is training publishers to be more conservative, more risk averse, more focused on proven properties than new concepts. Why greenlight a new survival horror IP when you can remake Resident Evil and get guaranteed sales? Why take a chance on an innovative game when you can remaster something that already succeeded? This creates a stagnant industry where fewer new voices get heard, fewer new ideas get funded, fewer risks get taken. We're moving toward a future of endless sequels, remakes, and reboots because that's what the market rewards. And we're all complicit every time we buy these games instead of demanding better. What actually works before anyone accuses this of being mindless negativity? Let's be clear about what would actually constitute a good remake. The standard isn't impossible. We've seen it done right. A good remake understands the source material deeply enough to recognize which elements were essential versus which were limitations. It preserves the core experience while addressing genuine problems. It expands rather than replaces. It's made by people who love the original, enough to spend time understanding why it worked. The Resident Evil 1 remake accomplished this. Shadow of the Colossus remake accomplished this. Metroid accomplished this. These are remakes that enhanced rather than replaced their source material, that respected what made the original special while genuinely improving the experience. The recent Resident Evil remakes could have done this. Imagine a Resident Evil 2 remake that kept the extensive Raccoon City streets, expanded them with modern detail, gave you multiple routes and meaningful choices. Imagine a Resident Evil 3 remake that preserved the live selection system, enhanced it with modern technology, created genuinely different playthroughs based on your decisions. Imagine remakes that added content instead of cutting it, that increased complexity instead of streamlining it. These remakes would have cost more to make. They would have taken longer to develop. They might not have appealed to as broad an audience, but they would have been worthy successors to the originals instead of pale imitations. They would have justified their existence beyond just the old games, but prettier. The reality check. So where does this leave us? With remakes that are good enough to be commercially successful, but not good enough to honor their source material. With an industry increasingly focused on exploiting nostalgia rather than creating new experiences. With fans who deserve better being told they should be grateful for products designed to extract maximum profit with minimum creative risk. The original Resident Evil games are better than the remakes in the ways that matter most for survival horror: challenge, player agency, vulnerability, resource management, replayability. The remakes are better in superficial ways: graphics, voice acting, accessibility, cinematic presentation. If you value the former, play the originals. If you value the latter, the remakes will satisfy you. But recognize what's happening. These remakes aren't acts of preservation, or love for the source material. They're business decisions made by corporations that have calculated nostalgia is more profitable than innovation. They're products designed by committee to appeal to the broadest possible audience while taking the fewest possible risks. You can enjoy them, you can find value in them, but don't pretend they're equivalent to the originals, and don't let the industry pretend that remaking old games is the same as creating new ones. Every dollar spent on remakes is a dollar that could have funded new IP, new voices, new ideas. The more we reward this business model, the more we're funding a creatively stagnant future. Where we go from here. The gaming industry will continue making remakes as long as they're profitable. The only way this changes is if we collectively demand better. Not just better remakes, but more new games, more creative risks, more respect for what made older games special instead of embarrassment, and the urge to modernize everything into homogeneity. Support developers who take risks on new IP. Buy games that try new things even if they're rough around the edges. Demand that remakes preserve what made originals special instead of replacing it with a generic modern design. Be vocal when remakes cut content and charge full price. Don't accept the false choice between progress and preservation. Demand both. The original Resident Evil games exist. They're still playable. They're still excellent. If you've never experienced them, track down the originals rather than settling for the remakes. Emulation exists. Old hardware exists. These games are worth experiencing as they were, not just as they've been repackaged. And if you do buy the remakes, at least be aware of what you're getting and what you're missing. Recognize them as separate experiences, not replacements. The remakes are fine games in their own right, but they're not Resident Evil as it was meant to be. They're Resident Evil as reinterpreted by modern corporate game development, with all the compromises and calculations that implies. Fans deserve better than being seen as a reliable revenue stream. We deserve games made with passion and respect, not just market analysis and profit projections. We deserve companies that value their legacy franchises for more than how much money they can extract from them. Whether we get that depends on what we demand and what we're willing to accept. So demand better, accept less, and maybe, just maybe, the industry will learn that fans are more than wallets to be opened with the right combination of nostalgia and marketing. The originals are still there, still excellent, still worth your time. Play them. Remember what made them special. And the next time a company announces another remake, ask yourself, is this made with love for the source material, or is this just another product designed to monetize your nostalgia? Most of the time, you already know the answer.